So I'd like to finish off the sugya and speak about ibud ba'oichlim, whether yesh ibud ba'oichlim or ein ibud ba'oichlim. So the Gemara brings that Rabbi Bar of Hana, Haimam de Malach Bisra, Chayiv Mishum Abid. So he holds that you're Chayiv Mishum Abid. And Rava says ein ibud ba'oichlim. And then Rav Ashi says, Afidu Rabbi Bar of Hana, Lo Olma Ela de Kaboy Lo Ucha. That even Rabbi Bar Chana only says that there's yesh ibud ba'oichlim where it's la'urcha for preserving for a long time for journey, av lebeisa, but if it's salting for the home, lo mashva inish michla 8, the person doesn't make food into 8 into something which is inedible. So first of all, what's the explanation of Rava who says ein ibud ba'oichlim? Why is there no ibud ba'oichlim? So he seems to say that fundamentally there's no ibud ba'oichlim, either because it's too dissimilar to the melachot of Ibud. The melachot of Ibud is with skin, where one's making something which will become a keli or some other functionality, like parchment or skins used for the roofing of the Mishkan. Whereas Oichel is food, Ibud isn't fundamentally not a food preparation of melacha. Alternatively, the function of ibud is to preserve l'olam forever or for a very, very long time. Whereas for food, even when it's l'urcha, when it's for the journey, it's just for a temporary delay of preservation in order to be able to eat it later. Either way, Rava holds it's not, there's no issa d'oraisa of ibud ba'oichlim. Rabbi Bar of Hana holds there is ibud of oichlim. Now, what's the pshat of Ashi's chiluk, where he says that there's a chiluk between whether it's lebeisa or l'urcha? So the simplest reading of Rashi is that it's about quantities, as Adam pointed out, the diuk in Rashi. That when you're salting for the journey, you put in a lot of salt. And therefore, Rashi's point is that if you put a lot of salt in l'orcha, then that makes the basar like 8, but you're doing it because you want to preserve it, even though it's ruining the edibility somewhat. And therefore, you are chayiv. Whereas if it's lebesa, it's smaller quantities, and therefore you are potter. However, there is an alternative explanation in the Gemara which the Achronim advance. I'm not going to go into the technical details of the proofs for this. It's basically based on a difficulty with a Gemara in Menachos, in which the Gemara is Doresh, Menachos Kafala, from which the Gemara is Doresh, that you can put salt on a carbon even on Pesach, even on Yom Tov, and even on Shabbos. And you can salt a carbon even on Shabbos. And the question is, why do you need a drasha to say you can salt a carbon even on Shabbos? And there's an extended discussion in Achronim about these and similar questions. And either way, based on this, the Shah HaMelech and other Achronim learn that the pshat in the Gemara is different. It's not about the quantity of salt, which is Rav Ashi's chiluk, that you put a large quantity of salt on the food when you're doing it l'orcha, and you only put a small quantity of salt on the food when you're doing it lebeisa. The chiluk isn't in quantity, but the chiluk is in intentionality. If you're intending to do it to preserve, then it is similar to the melachot of ibud, and you would be chayiv. If you're intending to do it for food, l'hatimo, to flavor it, then you are potter, and it's about intentionality. So besides the technical reasons why the Achronim advances Peshat based on a technical question from a Gemara in Menachos, this actually appears to be the simplest reading of the Gemara that doesn't say quantity, but says whether it's lebeisa or le'orche. That's the key determinant distinction. In which case, Rava says that fundamentally there's no ibud ba'oichlim. Rabbi Baba Rav Huna says there can fundamentally be ibud ba'oichlim. However, I would acknowledge that because it's an oichel, there's another significant reason why you might salt. And in that case, even though perhaps the outcome is the same, nonetheless, it wouldn't be considered ibud. Now, this could be because oichel fundamentally has another reason for salting in order to give it a taste, and therefore there's no ibud. And the whole chiluk of the Gemara is just in about intentionality. If that's the pshat in Rav Ashi's chiluk, it's a little bit difficult to understand the continuation of the Gemara, in which he says, "Lo mashve inish michla el eitz." The person wouldn't make their food into eitz, into wood. Make it inedible. Why is that the svara? The whole chiluk is that for oichel, it depends on intentionality whether you do it l'hatimo for taste or to preserve. So perhaps a different understanding of Rav Ashi is that he's saying, since you never salt food that much, whether you're doing it to preserve or for taste. You never tan it to the same degree, salt it to the same degree as you would with leather, because you're not planning to tan it and make it inedible. You're just planning to preserve it somewhat. So that it's always a lesser form of preservation. With this lesser form of preservation, it depends on your intention whether you're doing it for taste or for preservation. However, if you would do a full melicha, which literally makes it into 8, then I would agree that intentionality is irrelevant, because you've put so much salt on that you've turned it into 8. It must be for preservation. Either way, that's the second explanation of the Gemara, that it's about intentionality rather than about the amount of salt that you put on. Now, it's also pointed out to me that the Rach, Rabbeinu Chananel, brings a Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi also seems to say it's about intentionality rather than the amount of salt, because the Yerushalmi, the Rabbeinu Chananel explains in the Yerushalmi that kavanosu lotzeis lo derech, to go on a journey, is lav dafka. Even if your intention is to eat it at home, la'ochlo acha kama yomim, that's also enough to be chayiv. So he's explaining that the intentionality is either for a journey or even just to preserve it for home, as long as it's for kama yomim, and we'll come back to that phrase in a few moments. And nonetheless, you see seemingly in the Rach that it is about intentionality of preservation. So this was point number 1. Point number 2, just to mention briefly, is that I haven't managed to find clear makoros as to how long the ibud, the preservation, has to be for. And maybe they don't specify it because of the nature of how preservation works, that it's either preserved, in which case it will last for a long, long time, or it's not preserved, in which case it will go moldy and rot very quickly. And therefore it's not relevant to talk about a shiur about how long it's preserved for. Nonetheless, the Rabbeinu Chananel is an important maramakim in which he mentions kama yomim and seems to indicate that that's the shiur for preservation. The third point is that, again, it's not entirely clear as to how long the salt has to rest on the meat in order for it to count as ibud. There's a Maggid Mishnah in Perek Vav of Machalas Asuras Halacha Yud, who speaks about a time that it has to last. He says Kadei Shehilach Mil, which is perhaps 18 minutes. However, there doesn't seem to be a clear source for this year. The Chasam Sofer and Shabbos argues with this measure of time. It's not clear how long it has to be left on for. Again, it's interesting in this case where you are lahatima, where you're putting the salt on the meat. It would seem that nonetheless one is leaving the salt on the meat for long enough for it to, in theory, at least preserve somewhat the meat. And therefore, the shaila is about what the intentionality is. And that would determine, according to Rav Ashi, whether it is the melacha or not. How do we paskin with all of this? So the Rambam paskins that ein ibud ba'ochlim, in other words, he's paskining like Rava, and the Rashba, and the Magen Avraham brings this, says yesh ibud ba'ochlim, in other words, he's paskining like Rava bar Rav, and the Magen Avraham already asks on this that seemingly the Rambam is correct. We should paskin like Rava based upon the halachic principle of halacha kabasra. In general, we will paskin like the later Amora. Be that as it may, the nafkamina between whether yesh ibud ba'ochlim or ein ibud ba'ochlim is not whether it's mutter or asa. Either way, it's asa. The whole discussion is whether it's asa midiraisa, it's a melacha, or only asa midrabanan. The nafkamina will be, for example, with amir al-akum, where we're allowed to ask in a case of tzorech, gadol, or hefsek rubber, one's allowed to ask a non-Jew to do the melacha because of shvus to shvus, and if ibud is forbidden in HaTorah, one wouldn't be allowed to do amir al-akum, whereas if ibud is mutter min HaTorah and only asa rabbinically midrabanan, then one would be allowed to amir al-akum in the case of tzorech gadol, because it would be a double rabbanon. What about koshering meat on Shabbos, or indeed on Yom Tov? On Yom Tov, one might say, of course, one's allowed to salt meat to kosher because it's oichal nefesh. However, if the malacha is ibud, then one couldn't do ibud even for the sake of food, because it's not a food preparation type malacha, and therefore it wouldn't be hutar on Yom Tov for oichal nefesh. So can one do it on Shabbos, and even on Yom Tov can one salt meat? Well, we know you can salt meat on Yom Tov because you're allowed to shecht on Yom Tov, and therefore evidently lekula alma, this would be allowed. Why would this be allowed? Again, either according to Rava because ein ibud ba'ochlim, or even according to Rabba bar Rav Huna, as per Rav Ashi's svara, that since you're salting in order to produce the food and extract the blood, therefore it would be allowed. Now, this is good if it depends on intentionality. If, as per Rashi, it depends on quantity, and the reason why l'urcha is forbidden is because it's kamus rav, it's such a large quantity, as Rashi says, then I don't understand how Rashi would explain salting on Shabbos or Yom Tov to produce food, since even though his intention is to produce the food, nonetheless it's using a large quantity. So we have to set a difficulty. How would Rashi allow salting on Yom Tov if it's included in Ibud because it was a large quantity? Perhaps again, the determinant of the large quantity is whether it ruins the food permanently, whether it makes it into eights, and therefore with salting for blood, even though it's large quantity of salt, nonetheless it doesn't permanently ruin it, it doesn't make it into eights, and therefore that's the determinant of whether, even according to Rashi, it would be considered Ibud, or whether it would be considered permissible Melicha. As an aside, there are Rishonim that hold there's another Issa in Melicha and salting. There's a Rosh and a Rambam that seem to say that the Issa would be Schita because you're extracting the blood, in which case that would be Osa on Shabbos Min HaTorah perhaps, but on Yom Tov it would be Mutter because Schita, extracting liquid for food preparation, is Mutter on Yom Tov. There's also another Gemara, a Gemara in Shabbos Kuf Ches on the base, which according to Rashi says that you can salt, you're not allowed to salt a few slices of radish in one go, but you can salt them, dip them in salt one by one. There's a machlokas how to learn this, but the consensus is that this halacha applies to any vegetables, not just to radishes. Why is this also? Rashi says that this is a drabonon, because when you place them in salt, they begin the ibud, and therefore it's also midrabanon, even though you're planning to take them out and eat them. Nonetheless, it's all part of the issa drabanon. And then, however, if you do it one by one, just dipping it in salt, it's not like ibud, and therefore it would be mutter. This is how Rashi learns it. The Rambam says that it is a drabanon of pickling, which is a drabanon of cooking. In other words, even though cooking min haTorah is only with a fire to preserve food or to soften food and prepare it for achila, nonetheless, pickling is also a way of softening food and preparing it for achila and salting it, and therefore he says this is also asa. There's a note of Yehuda who explains that even though there's no gezerah with cooking in the sun, because it's not cooking through eish, that's because it's unusual to cook in the sun, and therefore they only made the gezerah if you cook on a metal heated by the sun, which looks like regular cooking, but cooking directly in the sun is mutter, they didn't make a gezerah. However, pickling and salting, which are common ways of preparing food, would be also midrabanon as a gezerah because it looks like cooking. And there's a third explanation, showing in the smug and so on, who say that you can't salt food on Shabbos because it's Masechet Shabbat, it's uvdud chol. It used to be apparently maybe in preparation for winter, they would salt or pickle large quantities of food to preserve them. And therefore this is a sort of laborious and large-scale food production operation, and therefore it's also on Shabbos because of uvdud chol. Now, there'd be several distinctions based on these reasons as to how this would work out in practical halacha. One nafkamina would be not salting, but pickling. According to the Rambam, you couldn't submerge vegetables in vinegar on Shabbos because this would also be midrabanon, a type of cooking. According to Rashi, this should be allowed because it's not comparable to salting leather. You don't tan by pickling in vinegar. There's also be enough gemina about whether you could salt on Yom Tov. According to Rashi, whether it is ma'abeid, a drabonon of ma'abeid, so ibud is also on Yom Tov, as we explained already. It's not one of the melachos of Eichel Nefesh. According to the Rambam, that it's a drabonon of bishul. Since cooking is allowed on Yom Tov, then pickling would also be allowed on Yom Tov. How do we paskin? So the Shulchan Aruch seems to bring both in Shin Kaf Aleph, in Sif Beis and Sif Gimel. He seems to bring Rashi and then to bring the Rambam, which implies that we take on the chumras of both viewpoints. Finally, one more thing to do with salting, which is the Mishnah in Kuf Ches, at the bottom of Kuf Ches Amud Aleph, and the top of Kuf Ches Amud Beis, and the Gemara afterwards, which the Gemara understands to be saying that you cannot make a large quantity of salt water on Shabbos, midrabanon. However, you can make a small quantity of salt water on Shabbos. And Rabbi Yossi says you can't even make a small quantity of salt water on Shabbos. What's the reason for this issa to make salt water? So the Ritva and the Ran and other Rishonim explain that this is a gezerah so that people don't think that you are pickling on Shabbos, and therefore you shouldn't make a large quantity of salt water. The Mishnah Berurah also in Shin Kaf Aleph Sif Kotten tests brings some achronim who say it's allowed if you have no intention to pickle, and the Eli Rabbah, and this is how we seem to paskin, says not to prepare salt water even if you don't have intention to pickle because it looks like you're preparing to pickle. So either way, there's an issur drabanan to prepare large quantities of salt water. According to Rabbi Yossi, even small quantities of salt water. Rabbi Yossi says, even though the appearance of pickling is only with large quantities, nonetheless, we don't want people to think that there are melachos and Shabbos where you can do small quantities and not large quantities. And therefore, the Gemara explains that yomu melachim ruba asa melachim uetas materes. Therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, don't even prepare small quantities of salt water. How do we paskin? Do we paskin according to Rabbi Yossi or not? And if we paskin according to the Rabbanon, what's called a large quantity, what's called a small quantity? The answer is most of the poskim paskin like the Rabbanon, that a small quantity is allowed, only a large quantity is aser. What's considered a small quantity, the Ran explains, it means the amount that you need for one meal. So you can prepare a small amount of salt water just for one meal, but not for a large amount of meal. And therefore, just before the Seder, if you haven't prepared your salt water and it's Shabbos, you can make a small amount of salt water in preparation for the Seder. However, lechatchila, better to make it before Shabbos because it's hard to be mashaya, hard to estimate exactly how much salt water is needed for one meal. However, one can make enough to dip the karpas, and if your minhag is even to dip eggs into salt water, then enough of that because that's preparation of salt water for a meal. I'll stop there, and with that we conclude our sugya of Ibud, Oichlim, and Imyat Hashem after Yom Tov we'll start the next sugya. I wish you all a good Yom Tov, a good and meaningful fast.